The recipe I have originally calls for pasilla chilies, and pasillas are a different kind of Mexican chili. They're a little probably darker and smokier, but I don't happen to have any on hand right now, and I didn't grow them last year, and so I'm just going to use anchos because I have a lot of those, and I know I really like the flavor of anchos. Ancho chilies are a ripe, dried poblano, and so if you've ever bought or grown poblano chilies, if you let them get red ripe on the vine and not green, and you dry them, you will have anchos. Whoops, whoa, okay. I'm making a mess here. And so what you want to do with dried chilies is obviously take the stems and most of the seeds out. And I could have heated these, and I thought about doing it in a toaster oven or a skillet to just warm them up. It makes them a lot more pliable and kind of gives them a little bit of a toasted flavor. But I'm not too worried about it today. I'm just gonna throw chili seeds all over my kitchen instead. I've been growing poblanos for years and years, and they're a very big plant. Typically, a poblano chili will get 2 feet high at least, and so they have a tendency to fall over if you get a windstorm. They need to be staked. Most chilies I can get away without staking, but these guys really do need to be staked up. And they don't produce a ton. It depends on your soil fertility, obviously, and your growing conditions. But I've never managed to get a giant crop off of one plant. So I might get 5 or 6 at the most off of one plant. So if you do a lot of cooking with chilies and anchos in particular, it's worth giving them some room and planning on planting quite a few plants. They take a long time to get ripe. And again, they tend to fall over in the wind, so they're a little bit tricky, but boy, are they delicious. And we really love them green as a roasted pepper or as a stuffed chili for making chili rellenos. And so we have many, many uses for poblanos, and so we just grow them every year. They are really wonderful. I've tried lots of different varieties over the years, different seed sources, some open pollinated, some hybrid. I've never really landed on one that I thought did better for my area than any other, and so I just kind of go with, you know, if I'm trying to mostly order seeds from one company, I'll just go with whichever one they happen to have on hand. The Bastion variety, which comes from Johnny's, a fellow farmer locally to me, had beautiful peppers, poblanos from those last year. I grew the same variety 2 years ago, and mine weren't nearly the size of hers. They do tend to get a little sunburned in the heat as well, similar to the way bell peppers can get sunburned, and so they could probably benefit from a little shade cloth. I've never done that before, but I think this year I am gonna put like a 30% shade cloth over my poblanos and see if I can get bigger peppers with less sunburn, because I tend to get sunburn on them every year. You don't have to get every single seed out of here. You just want to get the majority out. They're not exceptionally hot. It's a good idea to wear gloves. I once made the mistake of processing a whole bunch of Aleppo peppers that I didn't think were that hot without gloves on, and my hands hurt literally for several days afterwards. And it would finally go away, and I'd think I was done, and then I would get my hands wet and it would start all over again. So I've just really learned, put gloves on. It's definitely not worth the long-term skin irritation of not having gloves on, even though poblanos are not particularly hot. They're kind of a middle. I think jalapenos are considered hotter than a poblano. Although I've had some pretty hot poblanos, so they can vary. But they're very fruity. They have a really lovely flavor when they're dried. And ironically, because I have a bunch of my own homegrown ones upstairs, I make my own chili powder that I sell. And so these are actually store-bought anchos, because last year I was out, so I ended up having to buy some, and then I still had them in my cupboard. And so instead of using my own this year for this little recipe, I'm actually using store-bought. The other chili going in this is Arbol. Chili Arbol is a very hot Mexican chili. They're as hot as a cayenne, if not hotter. And so this is one that you absolutely want to wear gloves for. And years and years and years ago, I don't even think my husband and I were married yet, we were coming through Utah, and south of Salt Lake City, there was this little farm stand, actually not little, good-sized farm stand, and they had chili arbol peppers in a bag, dried, on sale. And it was probably at least a pound, and they don't weigh very much, and so a pound is a huge amount of chilies. And I had them for several years, and I was using like one at a time, and I was like, I'm never gonna use all of these. And we were working for the Colorado River Indian tribe at the time down in southern Arizona on the California border, and they used to do a big pit roast every year. And so I decided to take all of those arboreal chilies and make a hot sauce out of them, which I did kind of on the fly based on a local restaurant down there that had something that I really liked. And I knew their ingredients were only 5 ingredients, and so I just made something similar. And the people down in that part of the world, they love their hot sauce, because I made what had to be a quart, if not 2 quarts of hot sauce from that chili arbol bag, and it was completely gone by the end of the day. So it got eaten up and used up, and I was glad for it. But I remember just being absolutely gobsmacked that the entire container was empty by the end of the day. They really liked their hot sauce. That was the time when I was making that hot sauce. I actually roasted the chilies in a pan before I started processing them, and I literally fumigated the entire house. We had to leave the house and open all the windows and come back in 15 minutes later because it was so strong and they were so hot that basically I napalmed the room. And so, yeah, be very careful if you're going to ever roast chili arbols on the stove, because they will smoke you right out. I also need here, trying to remember the numbers, I think it's 3 cloves of garlic. And I'm going to go ahead and pick out this slight green sprout that's in there. And if you guys have an authentic Mexican chorizo recipe that you want to share with me, I would love to have it. It would be fun to play around with some other ideas on this. But I do love this recipe. It's quite good. It has a lot of vinegar in it, which won't be to everybody's taste, but I find it just delightful. All right, to this, I'm going to add 1/2 cup of white vinegar. And I'm just going to let that stew and soak for an hour or so before I blend it to reconstitute those chilies. right, you guys, it's the next day. And full disclosure, I messed this recipe up. I have multiple recipes for chorizo, and most of my sausage recipes are in 5-pound batches. And so I was assuming that this recipe was a 5-pound batch, and after I got everything completely mixed together, I realized, oh, no, wait, it's only for 1.5 pounds of pork, not 5 pounds of pork, which is a big difference. And so I actually calculated the salt based on the weight, and so I know the salt is correct, but everything else is quite under-seasoned, and I did fry up a little bit last night, and it was definitely under-seasoned. So at this point, I'm kind of punting, and I am adding in some additional vinegar, some additional onion, some additional garlic. And then I threw in, I'm kind of mix and matching this recipe with one from Hank Shaw for a Mexican chipotle as well. And he had suggested a little bit of chipotle powder and a little bit of cayenne. And so I ended up adding some of that. I added more Mexican oregano. And we're just gonna mix this together and fry a little bit up and see how it tastes. So, what I've got here now isn't bad. It's just under-seasoned. And the whole point of Mexican chorizo is it's chilies. And so it should have that lovely chili flavor to it. And, ideally a little bit of bite. And then with that vinegar, you get that little bit of brightness from the vinegar in there. And so, yeah, just mixing and matching and starting over. So we'll see where we end up here. Salt in a sausage recipe, a general rule of thumb is 1.5% of the weight of the meat. And so that's what you saw me measuring out there. And then me kneading this, it's really similar to, if you were kneading a loaf of bread, where once you get everything kind of sort of mixed in, you can just stir and fold, just like you would if it was a batter or a loaf of bread. But yeah, that's what you get for assuming and not stopping and reading all the way through the recipe because you've done it before and so you think you know what you're doing. And when you're mixing sausage, the key is to have everything as cold as possible, cold enough that it makes your fingers ache. And this is probably not as cold as it could be, but it's pretty decent. If it's too warm, the fat starts to melt and you get what's called schmear, which is instead of the meat fibers binding together to make a sausage, you just end up with kind of a melty mess. And so you can actually put a bowl underneath the bowl that you're mixing in with ice in it to really keep things cold, especially if you're doing this in the summer and your house is warm. All right, I'm going to assume that that is pretty good. And what I'm going to do here is just make up a little patty and throw it in my skillet and fry it off and give it a taste test and make sure we're not completely off. All right, you guys, got a little sample fried up here. Let's see how it tastes. Salt level is good. Yeah, that's delicious. I'm torn between wanting to add a little bit more actual heat to it, but not wanting to mix it again because I'd have to go get another pair of gloves. And those additional chilies that I threw in here, they haven't really had time to bloom and hydrate. It was already powder, so I just threw them in a blender. I think we're good. The additional vinegar was critical. It really needed the vinegar to brighten it up. So I will post the recipe that I actually made, and then I'll post a link to Hank Shaw's recipe. I was doing what I typically do when I make this kind of recipe, which is I look at a whole bunch of different recipes online, and then I kind of mix and match based on my own personal taste, my own experience, what sounds good and reasonable, what I like, what I don't like. And so your mileage may vary. Feel free to tweak this. Mexican chorizo is vinegar, some kind of oregano, some garlic, some chilies, and then you can add in whatever else you want, and you can change out the different kinds of chilies. Feel free to experiment. 1.5% salt, that's key. That's pretty much key to any sausage recipe. And this is gonna be fantastic when we go camping with some nice canned potatoes for breakfast or tacos for dinner. So give this a try. Feel free to experiment with just ground pork that you might be buying from the grocery store or that you got from your own pig. You don't have to overcomplicate it. If you really want to get into this, you can grind your own pork with a grinder. I often don't do that. I usually just use the ground pork that I got with the pig that I bought. But Mexican chorizo, absolutely delicious. Give it a try. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment. I have new content coming out every week.